70 to 79 AD. As Jerusalem, so Vesuvius. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Last time, we saw the Roman world boil in uprisings, war, and rebellion. The rebellion in Britannia had been crushed, but the rebellion of Judea still burned on. As we enter the 70s, gone was the Julio-Claudian dynasty, founded by Augustus, and emerging from the chaos was a new emperor named Titus Flavius Vespasianus. No one at the time knew whether this new emperor would last. The three prior emperors had all been ousted in less than a year. Vespasian, though, would go on to be the first member of a new dynasty, the Flavians. As he began his reign, he was sorely lacking in legitimacy. He had the support of many of the legions and the eastern governors, but he could not rest on his august pedigree to justify his place as first citizen. No, he would have to earn his legacy. The unstable years of the early 70s would give Vespasian plenty of opportunity to prove himself worthy. Here's what we'll cover this time. Part 1. The Sack of Jerusalem. Part 2. The Revolt of the Batavi. Part 3. The Flavian. Part 4. Vesuvius. Part 1. The Sack of Jerusalem. When Nero was toppled and the carousel of emperors began in the year 69, Vespasian was tied down, crushing the Jewish revolt in Judea. He had successfully recaptured the region of Galilee in the north and had begun to make inroads into Idumea and Judea proper. The noose was tightening on Jerusalem, and it seemed only a miracle could halt Vespasian's advance. That divine intervention seemed to arrive in 69 when Nero was toppled and Vespasian halted his campaign. But the reprieve was only temporary. A year later, Vespasian was now emperor, though stationed in Alexandria for the moment. The rebels in Jerusalem offered both a challenge to his legitimacy and an opportunity to prove his worth. As the head of the Roman state, Vespasian was needed in Rome to put things back together after the year of civil war that only ended when soldiers loyal to him stormed into the city. The task of capturing Jerusalem would have to fall to his son, Titus. Titus was born in 39 AD, under the reign of Caligula. He was the oldest son of Vespasian, and as a young man, he had been raised beside Britannicus, the son of Claudius, who was killed by Agrippina and Nero. Titus had proved himself capable of leading the army during the campaigns of 67 and 68, helping to subdue Galilee. Now with Vespasian the new emperor, Titus was placed in control of a veteran corps of the army. He made his way from Alexandria to Nicopolis, where he and his army boarded ships and traveled down the Nile Delta toward the sea. They disembarked and traveled overland, hugging the coast of the Sinai. Turning north, they passed through modern Gaza, then to Ascalon and to Joppa, finally stopping at Caesarea, where he would prepare his full army for the assault. His campaign would launch from here. The Roman army traveled south now, passing through the hilly country of Samaria and stopping at a Roman garrison town called Japhna. After resting a day, they began the journey up toward Jerusalem. A few miles north of the city, the army halted, and Titus, with 600 of his cavalry, rode ahead to see the state of Jerusalem. This was both a scouting mission and a demonstration to rebel observers of what was coming. Titus hoped seeing the Romans approach would convince those in the city to surrender. He had received reports from refugees inside the city of the constant infighting, backstabbing, and division between the radical factions inside the city. Many of the residents of Jerusalem remained unaligned and were more accepting of the idea of surrender. But their fear and weakness was overpowered by the zealotry of the radicals under Simon, John, and Eleazar. Titus and his cavalry rode up close to the city walls on the north side, and at first found only a deserted landscape. Then suddenly, a large number of rebels sprung out to attack them. Titus was nearly surrounded, with the city walls behind, and hemmed in by the gardens, hedges, and trenches covering these suburbs. Titus and his cavalry's only option was to charge ahead at the rebels. They crashed into the rebel lines and broke through. Titus and most of the others made it back to the camp alive. The next day, the Roman camp was moved closer to Mount Scopus, about a mile from the city, where 4 years prior the Syrian governor Gallus had made his camp. From here, Jerusalem was in view. Another legion took up a position to the east of town on the Mount of Olives. Seeing the Roman siege beginning, the factions inside the city put aside their differences for a moment and sallied out toward the east, crossed the Kidron Valley, and rushed up the Mount of Olives and attacked the unprepared legion. Intense, chaotic fighting took place, but Titus was able to come in and break the stalemate. The rebels fled back inside the walls. Several days passed as Roman engineers cleared the suburbs to the north of the city of trees and hedges, preparing the land for an assault. The Jewish holiday of the Passover was soon arriving. As happened every year, the population of the city swelled as pilgrims arrived to celebrate. You do have to wonder what those entering the city thought about the large Roman army waiting just outside of town, though. At the same time, inside the city, factional fighting blazed back to the surface. Eleazar, whose faction controlled the temple complex, opened the temple up to allow the residents and pilgrims to enter for the Passover. But John's faction smuggled weapons into the temple courtyard and attacked Eleazar's men, killing him and seizing the complex for themselves. As the siege begins, it will help to describe the fortifications of Jerusalem. The city was protected by 3 sets of walls, a fortress overlooking the temple and the temple complex itself. The outermost wall was the 3rd wall. This was the newest wall, and it extended from the older parts of the city to the north and west, enclosing the new Bethesda neighborhood. The 2nd wall was older and enclosed a smaller area on the north end of the old town. It met up with the fortress of Antonia and the 1st wall. This 1st wall wrapped around the majority of the city, enclosing the upper and lower city and some of the Kidron Valley before meeting up with the walls of the temple complex itself. The fortress of Antonia was a Roman-built fortress, able to house a legion of soldiers, which was just to the north and slightly higher in elevation than the temple. Last was the temple complex itself, which can be imagined as a series of concentric courtyards, each separated by walls, with the temple itself at the center. Though it was not designed for defense, the thick and high walls were formidable obstacles. After clearing the land outside the north of the city, Titus and his army set about breaking into the outermost wall. The Roman engineers began to build ramparts over the wall, while facing a barrage from the rebel defenders. The rebel Simon had placed artillery, think catapults and large crossbows, upon the wall, which the rebels had captured from Gallus's attacks several years earlier or taken from inside the fortress of Antonia. They were formidable machines, but not too effective, as the rebels had no experience in using them. The Romans answered with return fire from their archers and their own siege weapons. For days, the Romans were prevented from completing their ramps. Then Titus had 3 siege towers constructed, and from here his men were able to shoot down at the defenders on the wall. The rebels now fled, and the engineers were able to finish their ramparts, which were mounted and the gates opened. On the 15th day of the siege, Titus and his army entered the first section of the city. They demolished much of this neighborhood and made their new camp here. The legions quickly began to assault the 2nd wall, and with their momentum, it took just 4 days to break through and enter this next section of the city. But as they entered within the narrow gap through the 2nd walls, they suffered heavy losses by the defenders, and many Romans died trying to retreat back out. A larger hole had to be made, allowing a larger force to enter in. The defenders retreated now into the remainder of the city. But any further progress for the Romans in this direction would be tougher. From here, as they assaulted the first walls, they could be bombarded with projectiles from 3 sides. The fortress of Antonia above and behind them, from the temple complex above them, and from the first walls in front of them. Instead of facing the gauntlet that would meet them if they had directly assaulted these walls, Titus now directed his attacks on the fortress of Antonia, besieging it from the north. Over 17 days, siege towers, battering rams, and ramparts were built. When the command was given and the assault on the fort began, the siege weapons rolled toward the wall. But as they reached their point of contact, they suddenly crumbled and fell into the earth. The rebels had dug a mine just outside the wall and set it on fire, collapsing it just as the Romans began their assault. The siege equipment fell into the pit and burned up in the flames. The siege weapons were destroyed and the Romans were stopped for now. With Roman morale low after this setback, Titus distracted his army by having them construct a circumvallation, a wall around the whole city. The wall they built was 4.5 miles long and had 13 towers guarding it. This structure stopped supplies from getting in and prevented the residents and pilgrims from leaving. Anyone found trying to leave was crucified in view of the city. On one hand, food had been stockpiled in preparation for the siege, which would be adequate to feed the residents of Jerusalem for several years. On the other hand, remember that the population inside the city was swollen by the many pilgrims who had arrived for the Passover. Many of them, and surely many of the less radical residents, now pleaded with the leaders for surrender. Better to do it now than face starvation in a year or a violent sack of the city when the Romans eventually broke in. But one faction of the Zealots, we aren't sure who, seeing the loss of resolve of the people, came to the food stores and set them on fire, to incentivize them to fight with vigor against the Romans. I doubt this convinced many, but it did make the situation of the defenders all the more desperate. Famine began to spread in the city. Around this time, Josephus reports an omen of the city's downfall. On the feast of Shavuot, 50 days after the Passover, while the priests were in the inner courtyard, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a multitude saying, "Let us remove from here." With the city encircled, Titus restarted the assault on the fortress of Antonia in late July. The rebels had destroyed the siege equipment in the first attack, but the flaw in this was that their mine had weakened the wall's foundation. Battering rams on the first day of the assault made little impact on the stones, but during the night a portion of the weakened wall collapsed. The legions breached into the fort, which they won control of in a tough night battle. This fort gave the Romans a dominant position in the city. They could now fire down into the temple complex, which the fort bordered. The siege was entering its climax. Josephus supplies the account of the siege of the city in detail, and though he shows bias toward Titus and Vespasian, his patrons, he's the best person to write an account because he was there at the siege, working for the Romans. Formerly a high-ranking administrator in the independent Jewish state, he was a powerful tool in negotiating. With the Romans inside the fortress now, Josephus was sent to negotiate with the rebels, pleading with them to surrender or face extermination. The zealous rebels must have scorned this traitor, and they refused his offers. By now, the famine was reaching desperate levels. Josephus says, "Pitiful was the fare and lamentable the spectacle, the stronger taking more than their share, the weak whimpering. Wives would snatch the food from their husbands, children from fathers, and most pitiably of all, mothers from the very mouths of their infants. Deserters told of corpses everywhere, stacked up and left unburied." With peace off the table, Titus began his assaults on the temple itself. The thick stone walls made the battering rams useless. A wooden bridge was built from the fortress to the top of the temple complex walls. When the sections of walls were undefended, 100 Romans began to scamper across. The rebels had been waiting for this moment. They lit the high bridge on fire, and the Romans fell down into the city and were crushed or slaughtered. Titus next tried a direct assault over the walls, but his soldiers faced heavy losses. Several times the Romans and Jewish rebels clashed outside the temple, sometimes at night, sometimes at day. It was chaotic fighting in confined areas, and the rebels repeatedly got the better of the Romans. Titus now destroyed the northern colonnade of the complex to allow easier access for his soldiers. With the area cleared, his legions made headway and the rebels retreated from the courts into the temple itself. The Romans assaulted the next set of walls, and flames were lit on the silver gates. The doors caught fire, and the flames spread from here to the rest of the cloisters, severely damaging the outer walls. The rebels made another last, desperate, starving foray as the engineers cleared the crumbled outer walls and prepared for a final assault. The Romans were pushed back one final time. The innermost courtyard must have been packed full with the thousands of rebels and refugees, the wounded, the sick, and the starving. Titus began his last assault the next morning. As fighting began again, a Roman soldier grabbed a burning timber. Being hurried on by a divine fury, he snatched something out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were around the holy house on the north side of it. The fire caught and began to grow. Seeing the holy house on fire, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an infliction required, and ran together to prevent it. No longer did they fight or attempt to spare their own lives, but with all their remaining energies, they tried to put out the fire. Since the holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was they kept such a guard about it. Titus heard that the temple was on fire and rushed over to try to put a stop to it. He ordered his soldiers to stop fighting and put out the flames. His shouting and motions went on deaf ears and unseen eyes. His soldiers were caught up in the moment of slaughter and ignored their general. Each one's own passion was his commander at this time. Instead of putting out the fires, the legions added to the flames. It was a chaotic scene of slaughter, smoke, and trampled men. They were spurred on by passion, by hatred of their enemy, and by hope of plunder. And so, the mighty temple of the Jewish God, built by Herod the Great and center of the Jewish religion, was engulfed in flames. Its marble facade crumbled and crashed down to the ground, the gold melting and dripping into the stone. It was no more, a pile of smoking ruins surrounded by thousands of the dead. Listen here to Josephus's post-mortem. It was the most admirable of all the works that we have seen or heard of, both for its curious structure and its magnitude, and also for the vast wealth bestowed upon it, as well as for the glorious reputation it had for its holiness. Yet one might comfort himself with this thought, that it was fate that decreed it to be so. Josephus claims the date of its destruction was the same month and day as the destruction of the previous temple at that same site by the Babylonians more than 600 years before. As mentioned earlier, Josephus tries to portray Titus in a favorable light. Blame for destruction of the temple is shifted as far from him as possible, and he is claimed to have wanted to preserve it. We don't know the truth, and it's very possible to speculate that Titus was more involved in the destruction than Josephus lets on. It seems, from what happens next, he was more committed to crushing the Jewish rebels than securing peace. The slaughter in the temple courtyards was horrible. Thousands killed without mercy, with no regard to age or sex, combatants or not. Titus now ordered a victorious burnt sacrifice of a pig be made on the ruins of the temple. John and Simon had both survived the fall of the temple and made it into the rest of the city. They now asked for surrender. Titus refused. The rebels made a final stand in the upper city, but their defenses were crushed. The last holdout was in Herod's palace, but this fell within a month, and by September 8th of 70, the city was under total Roman control. Josephus puts the death toll for the Jews in Jerusalem at 1.1 million, with another 100,000 taken into slavery. These numbers are inflated, but it probably was in the hundreds of thousands, given all the pilgrims in the city for the Passover. Tacitus claims there were 600,000 in the city. Among those taken captive were the rebel leaders John and Simon, who were both brought as captives to Rome. The rubble of the temple was looted. The great menorah, the table of the showbread, and a scroll of the Torah were among the precious artifacts seized. Titus ordered every stone of the crumbled temple be torn down, and the courtyards were destroyed as well. Most of the city was destroyed. Archaeological investigations show evidence of huge fires that burned the upper city. The pool of Siloam in the lower city was so covered with debris and ash that it silted up and became unusable. Jerusalem had been brought low, but that didn't mean the revolt had been totally wiped out. A few strongholds held out longer. Titus wouldn't be leading these last sieges, though. He headed back for the coast, where he celebrated his victories at Caesarea and at Antioch. When the winter of 71 had ended, he sailed for Rome, captives and booty in tow. The last holdouts of the Jewish rebels were at the fortress of Masada, built on top of a hill to the southeast of Jerusalem near the Dead Sea. We don't need a play-by-play here, but the Romans slowly constructed a huge siege ramp up to the city. Just before the Romans broke in, the rebels took poison. When the Romans crashed through the walls, they were met with only silence and bodies. The Great Jewish Revolt was over. Its bloody outcome could have been avoided. It's easy to imagine another scenario where the Romans are more conciliatory in the first place and avoid sparking the revolt altogether. Or, if Gallus had successfully recaptured the city in 66, it seems likely that little would have changed, apart from more direct Roman rule and the rebel leaders killed. I don't think the temple would have been destroyed. Or if Corbulo were governor of Syria when the revolt happened. Or if Vespasian had continued his approach to Jerusalem in 69, and word had never come of Nero's death. 1,000 counterfactuals, and few with so severe an outcome. But the rebellion had been left to fester for 4 years as resentment, hatred, and desperation grew. The conflict had grown from merely a restoration of order to force the sacrifices of the temple for the emperor to resume to a victory of the Roman religion over the Jewish one. By the time Titus was assaulting the city, he had to decisively crush the rebellion. His father's legitimacy as emperor was depending on it. Titus had won, and Rome had crushed rebel Jerusalem, and Vespasian had his signature triumph. Jews across the empire were soon forced to pay a new tax to replace the voluntary offering they used to make to their temple. This Jewish tribute was used for the reconstruction of the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, a humiliating proof of Roman supremacy over Judaism. The Jewish religion had been defeated thanks to the work of Titus and his father. Before we finally return to Rome for the triumph of Titus, we and Vespasian have to deal with another threat to Roman stability. Part 2. The Revolt of the Batavi. On the far side of the Roman Empire from Jerusalem was the province of Germania Inferior, along the southern shore of the Rhine River, where it bounded the North Sea, in modern Netherlands and Belgium. Among the inhabitants of this wet and misty land were the tribe of the Batavi, whose home was an island in the Rhine River. Since Caesar, they had been Roman subjects. Instead of paying tax, their tribute was in military service, forming an elite company of auxiliary soldiers. Given the small size of the tribe, probably 35,000 at most, the numbers point to heavy involvement in the military. Almost half of all adult males would have served in the Roman army, likely a son from every family. They were considered the best of the auxiliaries and operated almost as a Marine Corps or Navy SEALs, able and even adept at crossing rivers or expanses of water and attacking in full armor. The Batavi had been a key part of the Roman conquest of Britain in the 40s, and many had served there since, helping to expand Roman control by excelling in the many low and marshy areas. They also would have taken part in stamping out Boudicca's revolt in the 60s. Chief among the Batavi was a veteran named Julius Civilis, who came from an old royal family of the tribe. He had risen in power, now leading the 8 Batavian cohorts. His name Julius indicates that he received his citizenship under Caesar or Augustus. In 66, the Batavi were recalled from Britain and sent back home, and here is where the trouble began. Both Civilis and his brother were soon arrested by the governor of Germania Inferior on charges of conspiracy to rebellion. His brother was executed for the offense, but due to his citizenship, Civilis was eligible for an appeal to the emperor, and he was transported to Rome. At nearly the same time, Galba began his march on Rome. As a fellow revolter, when he became emperor in 69, he pardoned Civilis and sent him back home. During his short reign, Galba appointed Vitellius as the new governor of Germania Inferior. Vitellius, under urging from his legions, who weren't fond of the Batavi it seems, arrested Civilis again. But things changed rapidly that year. Soon, Otho overthrew Galba. Vitellius was now hailed as emperor by his legions, who were the ones calling the shots, and they marched away for Rome to topple Otho. Before Vitellius left, Civilis was freed once again. We discussed the following events last episode, where Vitellius' army defeated Otho at the Battle of Bedriacum, and Vitellius became the 3rd emperor of the year. Since Augustus, the emperor had been protected not only by the Praetorian Guard, but also by a corps of German bodyguards who were drawn from the Batavi. As the new emperor, Vitellius disbanded these bodyguards. As we just saw, Vitellius was pushed around by his Rhine legions, and they wouldn't have been agreeable to his being guarded by the Batavi. These bodyguards now returned home, adding their discontent to the population. Word soon reached the Batavi that Vespasian had proclaimed himself as a challenger to Vitellius, and the legions of the East and the Danube legions had joined in to support him. Some of the old veterans would have been familiar with Vespasian from serving alongside him during the conquest of Britain. Vitellius began scraping together more soldiers to defend himself, and he decided the Batavi could be a bigger part of his defense. He sent recruiting centurions to Batavia, where they began trying to recruit more auxiliaries. A few problems arose. The Batavi were already heavily enrolled in the army, and taking more men away from home was beyond the quotas required of them. Not only that, but the recruiters acted cruelly and offensively. They were accused of sexually assaulting some of the Batavi boys. Outraged now, the Batavi people threw the centurions out. According to Tacitus, Civilis then gathered the leaders of the Batavi to a banquet in a sacred grove. Their discontentment, their outrage, and the absence of most of the nearby legions combined, and they agreed to rebel. Civilis would lead this rebellion. He must have felt a deep betrayal because while he had faithfully served the Romans for decades, his own brother had been executed and he had been jailed. His experience in the armies informed his strategy. He knew they would have to proceed with cunning. First, Civilis convinced the Canonifates, a neighboring tribe who lived between the Batavi and the North Sea, to openly rebel. The leader of the Canonifates recruited help from the powerful Frisians who lived on the far side of the Rhine River, and they swooped on 2 Roman units by the sea and overwhelmed them. The Romans were completely unprepared for the attacks, and they were wiped out. A man named Flaccus was the new leader of the Rhine legions, and he immediately sent 2 legions to help, the 5th and the 15th, along with some auxiliary units, including a unit of Batavi cavalry. This Roman army advanced up the Rhine toward the Canonifates. Before they arrived there, they learned the Batavi were the masterminds behind the revolts, and soon a battle took place at Neus, near the modern border of Netherlands and Germany. The crux of the battle came when the Batavi cavalry unit deserted the Romans and joined their countrymen. The two legions had taken heavy losses, and they pulled back and retreated to a fort called Castra Vetera in modern Xanten, Germany. By defeating the legions, Civilis had secured independence and was on his way to becoming king of the Batavi. Then, in September of 69, Civilis made the questionable decision of attacking the legions holed up at Castra Vetera. This move all but guaranteed a huge Roman response. The soldiers of Civilis assaulted the fort, but it was too well defended, and they had to resort to a siege. Flaccus was now in a conundrum. It was his duty to come to the aid of the two defeated legions, and his soldiers, who hated the Batavi, encouraged this. On the other hand, legions loyal to Vespasian had reached Italy. If Vespasian won, perhaps he would side with the Batavi for their help in tying up the Rhine legions and stopping them from coming to help Vitellius. Flaccus would wait and see what happened before making a decisive move. That didn't mean he couldn't prepare, though. Flaccus gathered several legions to him. The 22nd, the 16th, and the 1st legions came under his command, and another legion was already at Mainz. Flaccus made his way to a strategic position, but then stopped to see which imperial claimant would come out on top. By late October, word arrived that Vespasian's army had defeated the one loyal to Vitellius. The news of Vespasian winning would have been taken poorly by the Rhine legions, who backed Vitellius. The officers convinced the soldiers to swear loyalty to the new emperor, which they did without enthusiasm. But the picture was now clearer for Flaccus. If Civilis was actually an ally of Vespasian, the war should be over now. But Civilis continued his siege, and it became clear that he fought not for Vespasian, but for the Batavi. Flaccus began his counterattack. But Civilis wouldn't allow him to reach the besieged fortress, where the combined number of Romans would be overwhelming. While the Romans were about 35 kilometers away, under cover of night, 8 cavalry cohorts surprised the Romans at Crefeld. Tacitus says the legions were nearly defeated until a cohort of Basque auxiliaries arrived and turned the battle. The Romans then got the better of the fighting and defeated many of the elite of the Batavi. The Roman losses were even larger, but they lost mainly raw recruits and auxiliaries. This was an important victory that sapped the strength of Civilis's rebellion. Unable to stand against the Roman army coming for him, Civilis now abandoned the siege of Castra Vetera. Flaccus and his army marched to the fort and reinforced it. Before they could use the fort as a launching point for an attack on the Batavi homeland, word reached them that 2 German tribes had crossed the river a ways to their southeast and were threatening the key city of Moguntiacum, which I'll just call by its modern name, Mainz. Protecting this city was the priority, so the Castra Vetera garrison was left behind again, and Flaccus headed back upriver. At Neus, on the festival of Saturnalia, Flaccus impressed his soldiers by giving them an unexpected bonus. The legions took the opportunity to splurge, and they fell into a drunken party. Things got rowdy, and then out of hand, and in the darkness, soldiers charged into Flaccus's tent and murdered him. Leaderless now, the army split up. Civilis put Castra Vetera back under siege. His rebel army was in a stronger position than they had been a month before. Flaccus was dead, and the army he commanded had splintered. In the fort, the Romans were nearly out of supplies. They surrendered, and an agreement was made in which the Romans left with their lives, but the fort was looted of all its supplies. The 2 legions left without their weapons, but a short distance outside they were ambushed and slaughtered. Civilis now captured much of Germania Inferior. Things further south in Gaul were devolving as well. A man named Julius Sabinus of a Gallic tribe had just been proclaimed emperor of a new Gallic empire. The 1st and the 16th Legion, who had been part of Flaccus's army, joined the rebel Gallic tribes. The Batavian revolt had started a landslide of rebellions. Vespasian was emperor now, and it fell to him to bring order to his empire. He appointed his son-in-law, Quintus Cerealis, who had prior experience in Britannia. Vespasian and Cerealis weren't messing around. They gathered 4 legions and the new legion Nero had commissioned in his last days and marched north to crush the rebellions. They met 2 more legions along the way. Their force of numbers was so large, a few of the rebels surrendered as they approached. The Gallic Empire proved short-lived and poorly coordinated as Julius Sabinus and his armies were quickly defeated by the Sequanii, another Gallic tribe loyal to Rome. The immense army under Cerealis' command swept north across Gaul and pushed the Batavi and their allies back into Germania Inferior. Civilis retreated back into his homeland of Batavia and launched several raids causing damage and destroying a detachment of the Roman navy in the area. But Cerealis' advance was only slowed, and he began preparing to attack Batavia itself. At the same time, word reached this far corner of the empire of Titus's victory in Jerusalem. Several more legions had just become available. As the army of Cerealis began to invade Batavia, Civilis came to negotiate a peace. A bridge was built over a nearby river, and the 2 sides met in the middle to talk. Tacitus' account breaks off here, and the details of their agreement is unknown. The Batavi continued to supply a large number of auxiliary troops for the Roman army. The capital of the Batavi was destroyed and rebuilt a few miles away in a less defensible position, and a legion, the 10th, was stationed close by. Vespasian was saved from a troubling loss of prestige and from accusations that he had recruited the barbarians, the Batavi, to fight fellow Romans. They certainly had helped him win the war by locking down troops loyal to Vitellius, even if it was done for their own motives. Cerealis was honored for his victory and awarded with a consulship, and the next year he was made governor of Britain. This victory, along with the destruction of Jerusalem, proved an auspicious start for the new Emperor Vespasian. We've delayed our return to Rome, just as Vespasian had while he rested in Alexandria. But now, like the Flavian emperor, it is finally time to head to Rome. Part 3. The Flavian. Last time, we saw the general Antonius, who led the Danube legions, defeat Vitellius' army at the Second Battle of Bedricum and then march south, defeating the guard in the city who were loyal to Vitellius and securing the city on behalf of Vespasian. Shortly after, Mucianus, a close ally of Vespasian, arrived with more soldiers and set the city of Rome back in order. Mucianus eliminated those in the city who remained political opponents. There, with him helping, was the 19-year-old Domitian, Vespasian's younger son. Vespasian himself was still back in Alexandria, securing control of the vital Egyptian province. Vespasian didn't wait to return to Rome before he began to administer his empire. As we just saw, he appointed Cerealis to end the revolt of the Batavi. And of course, he had sent his son to finish the job in Jerusalem, which he had taken by September. Also pressing was securing the empire's finances. The treasury was in shambles after a decade of Nero's extravagant and flippant rule and the year of civil war which had rocked the empire. Employing soldiers to fight against each other was not free, and neither was buying the loyalty of the praetorians and the public, not once, but 4 times. In the last 2 parts, I've emphasized that Vespasian's legitimacy was still an open question, and no one knew if he would last 10 weeks or 10 years. His steps to refill the treasury were necessary, but did nothing to encourage the people to support him with cheering. Taxes would have to be raised. Vespasian set about implementing taxes with vigor. Old taxes were reinstated and reinforced. Greece was cut from the tax-free status Nero had granted it, and new taxes were made. The most odious of them was a new tax on the use of Rome's public urinals. His son, Titus, protested this new tax, but the story goes that Vespasian held a coin under his son's nose and asked, "See, my child, does this stink?" There must have been grumbling from the public over all of these taxes, because even today, the Italian word for a public urinal is Vespasiano. While Vespasian implemented the first of these new taxes, riots erupted around him in Alexandria. The unrest even disturbed the grain supply to Rome. Vespasian put down the revolts and ended the blockade with tact. The people in Alexander City were still proud to have an emperor amongst them. They declared him pharaoh, and he went on a goodwill tour, consecrating Egyptian temples up and down the Nile. With winter over and support consolidated, Vespasian finally made it to Rome. Vespasian arrived in the city and was hailed by the Senate and given all the rights of his predecessors from the Julio-Claudian family. He didn't consider this approval by the Senate as the beginning of his reign, though. That date came with the acclamation by his soldiers while he was in Alexandria. No, the Senate merely blessed his position and his right. Vespasian knew it was his army that had really made him emperor. Like any good emperor, though, he gave gifts to the Senate, the people, and the armies, which helped secure their loyalty. He took the opportunity, since he had supporting legions in the city who could defend him, to limit the power of the Praetorian Guard, reducing their number, removing them from guarding the gateway to the palace, and when Titus arrived, he was placed in charge of them as prefect. He successfully limited their influence, at least for several years. In the spring of 71, Titus finally arrived back in Rome after wintering in the east, and it was time for a triumph to be held. Both Vespasian and Titus had been voted the honor by the Senate, but they decided to combine their triumphs into one blockbuster event. Josephus provides us with the most in-depth description of a Roman triumph we have. Vespasian and Titus were acclaimed by their soldiers, covered their heads, and offered prayers to the gods. Countless treasures were displayed and marched through the city, not unlike a modern parade. Silver, gold, ivory, tapestries, dancers, parade floats with performers and scenes of battle, captives, and looted treasure all made their way through Rome. The highlights of the parade were items taken from the rubble of the temple, the great menorah, the golden table of the showbread, and a large Torah scroll. Among the captives was Simon Bar Giora, one of the Jewish rebel leaders. When the procession reached the forum, Simon was executed before the crowd. When the emperor, who rode a chariot with Titus at the end of the procession, got word that Simon had been killed, they stopped at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and offered sacrifices there. This triumph was used to show the Roman public a story of Vespasian and Titus's victories and display the glory he had brought to Rome. For the public, this triumphal victory marked the switch from Vespasian the usurper to Vespasian the emperor. As the dust settled and Vespasian became more established, he set about ensuring history would remember him favorably. He began a campaign of propaganda to continue to legitimize his rule. Remember, he was the first ruler since Augustus who couldn't point to his pedigree for legitimacy, so you can't really blame him. Part of the propaganda was an emphasis on the theology of victory, which argued that his victory over the Jewish rebellion and their god, along with his victory over the decadent and gluttonous Vitellius, gave him the right to rule. Stories of prophecies predicting Vespasian's rise were circulated. His dynasty funded several writers, including Josephus, Tacitus, and Suetonius, who all speak suspiciously favorably of Vespasian and Titus. Tacitus admits that his status was elevated by Vespasian, and Josephus had been spared by him, despite his rebellion. Several Stoic philosophers were exiled because of their, quote, corrupting influence on the people, and a philosopher named Helvidius Priscus was executed for his continued return to a republic preaching. Histories written about Vespasian by these and other authors had to be approved by him. Perhaps because of this censure, little is concretely recorded about his reign between 71 and 79. Part of this propaganda program was in portraying himself as a departure from the corrupt and decadent rulers who preceded him. Taking the moral reforms of Augustus as a model, he attempted to return the government to the traditional Roman values of austerity, simplicity, and honor. When he appointed an official, this man came to Vespasian, but he smelled strongly of perfume. Vespasian is claimed to have said, "I'd rather you smelled of garlic," and stripped him of the appointment. Vespasian had been born in a Sabine village in the hilly country northeast of Rome and frequently returned here to escape the bustle of the city. He made no excuses for his humble background. When a genealogist came to him and suggested they had traced his ancestry back to Hercules, Vespasian laughed him into silence. Vespasian secured his appointment as censor and immediately set to work remodeling the Senate as he saw fit, adding men from his own model who weren't corrupted yet by idle work or totally removed from labor. New blood was infused into the Senate from much of the west of the empire, not just old Roman families. These new men became efficient administrators and set the stage for the next several decades of prosperity. All this change was against the protests of the old patrician families, of course, but they had little recourse, with the army and the public now firmly on the Flavians' side. A few conspiracies are recorded as being planned against Vespasian, but all failed to make serious inroads against him. Adding to the reputation that he was constructing for himself was a building program. Rome had suffered during the Civil War of 69, and Vespasian set to work restoring and improving it. He finished construction of a large statue of Apollo that Nero had begun. He constructed a new temple of peace attached to a new forum of Vespasian. And we've already seen how he used the new tax on the Jews to rebuild the temple to Jupiter. Perhaps his most iconic project, though, was his beginning work on a new amphitheater, which is today called the Flavian Amphitheater, after its patrons. Spoils from the Roman sack of Jerusalem helped to fund its construction. This building was, and still is, the largest Roman amphitheater ever constructed, able to host over 65,000 spectators at its peak. You may know it by its common name, the Colosseum. Vespasian died before it could be completed. His focus was not only on the here and now. He invested in the future of the empire by funding the first stipends for educators to teach students in Latin and Greek. Yes, Vespasian's reign was a time of peace and prosperity for the people, or that's what our sources would have us believe. But we do get hints that there was not quiet on every front. There were rebellions in Pontus. A people called the Dacians were making increasingly troublesome raids into Moesia, and two cities in the province of Africa came to battle with each other. But these were peripheral concerns, and most Romans did experience a peaceful decade. The provinces are said to have flourished, whether due to prolonged peace or administrators who didn't squeeze every coin from the province to their own pocket. Citizenship was spread to many across the empire. We saw the Batavian Revolt and the attempt to create a breakaway Gallic empire. Unrest rocked Britannia, too, during the civil wars. First, in the far north of the island, the tribe of the Brigantes, who inhabited modern Lancashire and Yorkshire, drove out Cartimandua, their pro-Roman queen. Trouble wasn't limited to the barbarians. The legate of the 20th Legion there had mutinied against the governor and took control of the island. Vitellius, in his brief reign, had sent a new governor named Bolanus, along with the 14th Legion, who had ended the mutiny. When Vespasian took control, he recalled the mutinous legate and replaced him with Gnaeus Julius Agricola. Agricola was representative of the new blood in the Roman system. He had supported Vespasian during the civil wars and had been made a patrician by the new emperor. Agricola went to Britain and took command of the 20th Legion, instilling discipline among them. Bolanus was a mild governor, too mild for Vespasian, and in 71 he was replaced with Vespasian's son-in-law, Cerealis, who we met a few minutes ago as he put down the Batavi revolt. As governor, Cerealis adopted an aggressive posture on the unconquered regions of Wales and northern England, ending the threat of the Brigantes. As general, Agricola was able to display his talents, and major advances were made. Agricola stepped away from the island for a few years, during which he served as a governor in Gaul, married his daughter to Tacitus, and served as consul. In midsummer of 77, Agricola returned to Britain as its new governor. By the end of the 70s, he had led the defeat of the Ordovices and conquest of Wales. From a new fort at a site called Eboracum, which would later become York, in 79, Agricola advanced north into Caledonia, modern Scotland, to the Firth of Tay. There he built some forts and garrisoned soldiers, and prepared to finish the conquest of the rest of the island. As the decade comes to a close, we will have to leave Agricola's conquests unfinished and return to the old Vespasian for his final days. As the end of the 70s approached, though neither Vespasian nor anyone he knew would have called the years that, Vespasian decided his succession must be settled before his death. As he began preparing for his oldest son Titus to take his place, the Senate caught wind of his plans. Though most owed their position to Vespasian, they still grew squeamish at the idea of handing power directly to one son. Deep in the Roman cultural DNA was a rejection of monarchy, even if they were basically ruled by one, though they couldn't admit it to themselves. No emperor had successfully pulled off handing power to his son yet. The Senate insisted Vespasian should appoint the best of the best, and they would confirm his choice. They had a fellow senator in mind. Vespasian, though, presented Titus and asserted he had found their man. Vespasian began to delegate increasing amounts of authority to Titus. In early summer of 79, while Vespasian was in Campania, he came down with an illness and returned to Rome. Finding the city too noisy and stinky to really get some rest, he went out to his countryside estate in the Apennines northeast of Rome, not far from where he had been born. Hoping to relieve his symptoms, he drank copiously from a cleansing spring. It cleared him out, a little too well. He began to suffer from extreme diarrhea. As he felt death approach, he said, "I think I'm turning into a god." Then, insisting that an emperor ought to die standing, he called over his servants and died as they pulled him to his feet. Vespasian had been a good emperor. He stabilized the state after civil war ripped across the empire, and he oversaw the crushing of revolts in Judea, Britannia, Gaul, and Africa, ensuring the integrity of the empire. His new dynasty would go on to rule for almost another 2 decades. Although he had ruled effectively and justly, the cat was out of the bag now. He had proved that emperors could be made not just in Rome, but by the armies in the provinces. This secret was still only a whisper, and for a while it would not be spoken. Part 4. Vesuvius. 120 miles southeast of Rome, and just 8 miles from Naples lies Mount Vesuvius, easily visible from that old Greek city. Vesuvius isn't just any mountain, though. It is an active volcano, an especially active one. Although silent since 1944, it erupted 6 times in the 18th century and 8 times in the 19th, and at least 24 more times since the 1st century. These eruptions have varied in intensity, with most being small, though a few have been large enough to blanket much of southern Europe in ash. None of these eruptions compare to the intensity of the one in 79 AD, which caused tens of thousands of deaths and destroyed several towns. This area of Campania was a rich and pleasant region, home to many resorts for the wealthy, and several palaces of the imperial family were in the area. Part of the region's prosperity can be attributed to the fertile soil which was made by the volcanic ash of Vesuvius. Two towns in particular are worthy of our attention: Herculaneum and Pompeii. Herculaneum was a seaside retreat for the elite, wealthier and smaller than Pompeii. Pompeii was at least double the size of Herculaneum, and though in the rich region of Campania, it was a fairly normal city for the area. The history of Pompeii serves as a good refresher for early Roman history. Pompeii had first been settled by an Oscan people, but the Greeks had settled here beginning in the 740s BC. A temple in the Doric style was constructed during the 6th century. The city's walls were unusually long, encompassing much agricultural land outside the city center, showing it was already a wealthy place. During this century, the Etruscans controlled the area, using it as a waypoint between the coast and the interior. Their influence waned, and Greek control strengthened during the 5th century. By the end of the century, though, the Samnites were expanding their control, and they were able to capture nearby Cumae and presumably Pompeii as well. Then came the Samnite Wars with Rome during the middle of the 4th century. From here on, Pompeii was first a subject city and then an integrated Roman city, staying loyal even through the Third Samnite War and the war with Pyrrhus. During the reign of Augustus, Pompeii received running water from a branch of an aqueduct system that brought water down from the highlands to Naples. The town was also a common stopping point for travelers moving up the Appian Way. Living next to an active volcano, the residents of Pompeii would have been used to the occasional rumble or puff of smoke from the mountain above them. In 62, though, the city suffered from a severe earthquake that did damage to much of the region. A few structures in the ruins of Pompeii show that they had not yet been repaired from this earthquake almost 2 decades earlier. 2 years later, in 64, another small but noticeable earthquake shook the region. Supposedly, this took place while Nero was on stage performing in Naples. Apparently, though, the mountain was quiet for the next several years. Only in the months before the eruption did minor tremors become frequent again. The locals wouldn't have worried over these small quakes. We are fortunate to have an eyewitness account of the eruption from Pliny the Younger. He was the nephew of Pliny the Elder, who both led the Roman navy, which was stationed near Vesuvius at a port called Misenum, and who was a naturalist. Pliny the Elder wrote a huge and important tome called Natural History. Just as a side note, this work was hugely influential during the late classical and medieval period. It covers a wide variety of topics: astronomy, meteorology, geography, ethnography, anthropology, physiology, zoology, botany, pharmacology, mineralogy, and more. Pliny wasn't necessarily a creator of original thought, but his work collects information from across the classical world. Anyway, all that to say, we are privileged to get an account of Vesuvius' eruption from the author of Natural History's nephew. His description even comes to us by way of the letters he wrote to the historian Tacitus. On the fateful day, the two Plinies were at a villa in Misenum. Pliny the Younger was just 17 years old, and his mother Plinia was there, visiting with her brother, Pliny the Elder. The day started out peacefully, but early that afternoon, Plinia looked out the open window across the bay and gasped. What she saw was a huge cloud of ash rising from Vesuvius. Pliny the Younger recalls the sight. The cloud was rising from the mountain. I can best describe its shape by likening it to a pine tree. It rose into the sky on a very long trunk from which spread some branches. I imagine it had been raised by a sudden blast, which then weakened, leaving the cloud unsupported so that its own weight caused it to spread sideways. Some of the cloud was white. In other parts, there were dark patches of dirt and ash. Pliny the Elder was inside when Plinia came to him and told him what she had seen. He got his shoes on and went to the roof of his villa to get a better look. The sight of it made the scientist and my uncle determined to see it at closer hand. He ordered a boat prepared. The elder invited the younger to come with him, but the younger Pliny declined, preferring to stay home and read. As he prepared to board, he received a letter from a resident living near the base of the mountain, terrified of what was occurring. The mission shifted from scientific to rescue. 4 large quinquereme ships set out across the bay, heading to the other side, 20 miles away. The sky was already darkening by the clouds of ash. They were the only ships moving in this direction. The bay would have been full of boats of all sizes, desperately heading in the opposite direction. As they grew closer, warm ash began to blanket their heads, their clothes, and the decks of their ships. They continued advancing, and now rocks began falling into the sea around them in the dark of the day. Balls of pumice would have floated and bumped against the sides of the ships. As the ships approached the shore, they ran into so much debris in the water they couldn't properly land. The captain of the ship Pliny rode on suggested turning back, but Pliny replied, "Fortune favors the bold." They changed course and went a few miles further south, to Stabii, farther from Vesuvius, where conditions were a little better. They landed, and in Stabii they met with a friend of Pliny named Pomponianus. He was in a panic when Pliny and his crew arrived, and Pliny put on a cheerful face and calmed his friend. From here, they could see tall flames blazing from several points on the mountain. Pliny offered that these were probably only fires left in homes of people who had fled. By now, it was late, and Pliny went to bed. Outside his room, the courtyard began to pile up with ash and rock. The others, who hadn't been able to sleep, eventually went in and woke Pliny, so that he wouldn't be trapped in his room. Pomponianus and Pliny discussed what to do next. They could stay indoors and avoid the rain of rocks and ash, but the buildings were shaking in violent tremors. Instead, they chose to head outside. To protect themselves from falling stones, they tied pillows to their heads. It was day now, though the sunlight did not reach here. The company lit lamps, and Pliny went to the shore to see if they could escape in this direction. But the waves were far too high. He suddenly sat down and called for water to be brought to him. Flames and a strong smell of sulfur approached, and all the others ran away. Pliny stood up, then collapsed. That was the last anyone saw of Pliny the Elder alive. Pliny the Younger, who wrote this account, speculates his uncle had suffocated on the fumes. His body was found 2 days later, when light finally returned to the world. Pliny the Younger gives us an account of his own experience back across the bay in Misenum after his uncle left. He continued reading, dined, and then went to bed, but slept fitfully. That night, severe earthquakes shook the villa. His mother, Plinia, got him out of bed, and they went to the courtyard. For them, dawn broke, but only a dim light broke through the volcanic cloud. They feared their building collapsing around them, as several of the neighboring buildings already had. They decided to get out of town and run from Vesuvius. They called for a carriage and began to ride out of town. On one side was the sea, which had pulled back, revealing the seafloor and countless fish. Because of this detail, historians think a tsunami would have hit the bay. On the other side, a black cloud gushing flames and tongues of fire filled their view. This cloud sank and covered the sea as well as the island of Capri and the Cape of Misenum. The carriage shook terribly from the earth's trembling. Pliny and Plinia abandoned their carriage now and tried to flee on foot. Ash began to fall, but was not thick here. Pliny looked behind him and saw a thick black cloud advancing, gobbling up the land behind them like a flood. They left the road to avoid being trampled by the crowds of others who were also fleeing. A ways farther on, they stopped to rest, and the black cloud overtook them. Pliny said the darkness was not like a moonless night, but like the darkness in a completely closed room. Though their lamps only lit a few feet around them, they could hear the crying and shrieking of the crowds nearby. But then a glimmer of light appeared. It grew brighter. At first they thought it was the approaching flames, but the fires stayed away. Darkness returned again, and Pliny said the fall of ash was so heavy he had to keep standing up and shaking himself off to prevent from being buried under its weight. After a while, the darkness at last lessened, and a dim glimmer of daylight appeared. In the haze, they were amazed at what they saw. Everything buried deep in ash like snow. They now turned around and returned to Misenum and spent the next day and night alternating between hope and fear because of the continuing tremors and the hysterics of some people offering doom-filled forecasts. Those were the experiences on the ground, but today we know a little more of the wider view of what happened. Vesuvius erupted in August, the traditional date, or October, a more likely date based on the archaeology. The eruption lasted 2 days. A 2002 study concluded 2 explosions took place. The first was the one that sent a column of ash and pumice more than 9 miles into the stratosphere. This one blew downwind to the south, and over 18 hours it buried Pompeii in over 9 feet of pumice and ash. Herculaneum, Naples, and Misenum, which were upwind, were spared from the worst of this ash cloud. Late that night, pyroclastic flows began to rip down the mountain. A pyroclastic flow is a dense, fast-moving mixture of hot lava, volcanic gas, and ash, a volcanic avalanche. They can reach temperatures of over 800 degrees Celsius and travel an average of 60 miles per hour. During the day, they appear gray, but at night they can be seen to flame and glow. These pyroclastic flows knocked down structures in their path and incinerated anyone who had not fled. The majority of these flows spread to the southeast, smashing into Pompeii. The gases that killed Pliny the Elder and Stabii, which lies several miles farther from Vesuvius than Pompeii, were probably from the weakened edge of one of these flows. Pompeii itself was hit by 2 of these pyroclastic flows, adding another 6 feet of debris onto the city. Herculaneum was upwind of the worst of the first phase, but in the morning a large pyroclastic flow rushed down toward the northeast and buried the city under 70 feet of material. The aftermath of this pyroclastic flow may have been the return of darkness Pliny the Younger faced in the morning. Titus, who was now the emperor, appointed 2 ex-consuls to organize a relief effort. He donated money from the treasury to aid the victims and help rebuild. And like a modern head of state, he personally went to the disaster site and encouraged the survivors. There were many survivors. In Pompeii, which has been heavily excavated, fewer than 2,000 bodies have been discovered out of a population of 20,000. The rest presumably had fled. In Herculaneum too, most of the population had fled by sea. One of the largest concentrations of bodies, though, was found at the boathouse, where it seems they died while waiting to escape. Believe it or not, Herculaneum was actually the first of the 2 cities discovered. You wouldn't think so, given Pompeii's greater fame. Locals in the area had often run into buildings when digging beneath their farmland, but it wasn't until 1709 when a prince began constructing a villa in the area and caught wind of the locals discussing a buried town. He purchased the site of a well and began tunneling out from its base. The tunnel reached what has now been identified as a theater, and they discovered incredibly preserved statues. Word was out now, and major excavations soon began. Pompeii was buried less deeply, and it appears that survivors or thieves came to the city to salvage its valuables after the eruption. The tallest buildings would have remained above the new ground level, giving a reference on where to dig. There's abundant evidence of disturbance soon after the eruption, and even graffiti on a wall found saying, "House Dug." 300 years later, its site was still mentioned in an atlas. Slowly, though, the remnants of buildings crumbled, and further eruptions in the 400s and 500s buried or destroyed any remaining evidence. In the 1580s, an architect built an aqueduct straight through the walls of many buildings in Pompeii, and he encountered exquisitely painted frescoes, but he kept his findings secret. In the 1690s, a few walls were excavated, but not widely publicized. After Herculaneum's discovery, enthusiasm was high for more findings, and a Spanish military engineer made excavations at the site. Charles of Bourbon, the King of Naples, became interested because of the quality of its finds. Pompeii was not just some ancient ruin, it beautifully preserved a moment in time of the classical world. Fast food stands, colorful frescoes, lewd graffiti, and more. Pompeii and Herculaneum matter because they have given us a window into the first century Rome not offered by our sources. Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, and the others fixed their focus on the actions of the emperors, the Senate, and the military. We get few details of daily life, especially in the backwaters outside Rome or the major cities. But take a walk through the preserved streets of Pompeii, and I think you'll get to know the life of the Roman world much better. On a final note, one of the most exciting findings is a library in Herculaneum. Hundreds of scrolls were found in the 1800s in what has come to be called the Villa of Papyri. This appears to be a collection of works from the ancient world, but so far little has been able to be deciphered. The intense heat of the eruption carbonized the papyrus and left the scrolls brittle and charred. A few were opened over the past 100 years. They inevitably have crumbled, and their ink has quickly disappeared, if visible at all, after being exposed to the air. Much more was lost in these attempts than has been gained. In the past 2 decades, though, progress has been made on deciphering the scrolls without opening them, using X-rays to look inside without damaging them. In 2023, the Vesuvius project awarded $40,000 to a 21-year-old who was able to detect the first word in an unopened scroll. The possibilities of what could soon be revealed are enticing. Perhaps lost installments of the epic cycle to which the Iliad and Odyssey are only a part, or the lost history of Seneca the Elder, or writings of the Emperor Claudius. Something in that library, preserved by the fires of Vesuvius, is waiting to transform what we know about the classical world. That's it for this decade. Next time, we'll get to know Titus more personally, along with his younger brother, and we will come face to face with the Dacians. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, I would be grateful if you left a 5-star rating and a review. I'll see you next time.